Now, we all know that when it comes to making a film, it is a long and arduous process, and sometimes the final result that we see in the cinemas is definitely not the first cut of the film in general. It's gone through so many eyes, so many minds, so many notes, and so many test screen audiences that have all shaped the final product. But sometimes, even with this feedback and all the tweaking that's resulted from it, the film itself is just beyond saving. So let's take a look at these unfortunate projects. As I'm Jules, this is Whatculture.com, and these are 10 movies that studios tried and failed to fix after fan reactions. Number 10. The Lovely Bones. How do you follow 4 big-budget pictures, one of which is the greatest fantasy epic trilogy ever made? Well, by adapting a young adult novel about the rape, murder, and subsequent afterlife in limbo of a teenage girl, apparently. Or you do if you're Peter Jackson. Production of The Lovely Bones went smoothly, with a formidable cast in the form of Stanley Tucci and a young Saoirse Ronan. But audiences weren't happy at test screenings, complaining that the film's killer got away with too gentle and passive a death. Though Jackson had creative control over the film, he was encouraged by the studio to adapt the film to the audience's demands to satiate their bloodlust, extending the scene out and shooting more footage for maximum on-screen suffering while keeping the rating within a 12 to PG-13 limit. Unfortunately, the film was still a critical failure, with critics and audiences alike noting the troubling tone shifts from whimsical sentimentality to adult themes and violence. This was not helped by the surprisingly awkward, aka limbo visuals, and a structure that was better suited to the noble medium of the novel and not the big screen. Number 9. Prozac Nation. Adapted from Elizabeth Wurtzel's autobiography of the same name, Prozac Nation was one of the films responsible for transitioning Christina Ricci from Addams Family cutie pie to capital A adult actress. After premiering at the Toronto International Film Festival, Miramax saw an uncut gem with an established star and affordable price tag. What the studio didn't see was the detrimental effect their extensive involvement and tweaking would have on a reflective and somewhat non-narrative film about depression, which is obviously everyone's favourite subject. After a month's and then years-long cycle of test screenings, middling or negative audience reactions, and subsequent recuts, the film never received a strong or especially broad commercial release, and has since been forgotten amongst the 20-something percenters on Rotten Tomatoes. Number 8. RoboCop 2014. 2014's stylish RoboCop update took a solid concept, a high production budget, slick visuals, and an excellent cast, and made an entirely unexceptional film. One which wasn't out-and-out bad so much as being instantly forgettable. MGM initially believed that the film was overtly political, an opinion backed by the shoot-'em-up source material, and lacking the kind of explosive action it would take to propel the picture into true blockbuster success. But fans actually disagreed, explicitly praising the film for its current affairs approach. As a direct result of this feedback, the studio relented and made a few changes in the edit. Perhaps this was one instance where the studio should have stuck to their guns and gone against the fans. While a reasonable commercial success, RoboCop was passively received and has since been forgotten about by all but die-hard fans, and many of them weren't exactly singing its praises. Which is not a good sign for a film produced and released within spitting distance of 2012's instant cult classic, Dread. Number 7. Legend. While Ridley Scott doesn't have quite the auteur-driven filmography of a Kubrick or a Lynch, he nevertheless has a very strong track record with only a few straight out-and-out duds. Perhaps none, however, is more perplexing but also more straightforward than the Tom Cruise and Tim Curry dark fantasy epic Legend. For this, Scott's 4th film, he decided to break away from a strong sci-fi run and delve into fantasy, which on paper ought to have been a small step rather than a blind leap. At just over 2 hours on the initial edit, Scott thought that he could afford to trim some fat and decided to cut Legend down to 1 hour 50 before screening it to audiences. Following a mixed response where it was determined the audience had to work too hard to unpack the film, it was trimmed to 95 minutes for the UK release and then, in close coordination with Universal, 89 minutes for the US release, on the basis that American audiences could only be expected to cognate and ingest the bare minimum apparently. With the story now an incoherent mess, the film was a critical and commercial flop. Whether the studio or the director was ultimately responsible for this confusing and far from engaging feature remains uncertain, but Scott's 2002 director's cut suggests it might be the former. Number 6. Superman 4: The Quest for Peace. The now defunct Canon Films took the already failing but nonetheless bankable Christopher Reeve Superman series and pummeled its handsome face into the dark side of the moon, never to be seen again. As superhero series derailing films go, Superman 4, the 5th installment in the original Superman saga, rivals X-Men: The Last Stand for pole position. Cannon not only slashed the budget, $17 million, which is less than half of Superman 3's $39 million budget, but they also hacked the film up as well. The screening of a lengthy 134-minute cut of the film shook the studio when audience reactions were overwhelmingly negative. As a direct result, the film was cut to just 90 minutes, removing a host of key details and moments that, though the film had already cheaped out on its production and design, only served to weaken it further. Number 5. The Wolfman, 2010. The Universal Classic Monster series had been trying and failing to take off for a very long time by 2010, capped with more than a handful of big-budget Dracula and Mummy disasters. But The Wolfman was the film that put the final nail in the coffin of that decade of remakes, prior to Universal gearing up and nonetheless failing with 2014's Dracula Untold in order to produce a new line and connected series of these films. Test screen audiences were shown a range of cuts for The Wolfman, and Universal determined that they preferred the longer version. Thus, in a rare instance of the studio opting for the longer cut, they chose to stick it out with the 2-hour version. Though grounded in an all-star cast of serious acting talent, The Wolfman's broody and plodding final cut failed to rein in much interest. Curiously, even Ronald Mayer, the president of Universal Studios, spoke out against the film upon its release. Number 4. Thor: The Dark World. With the second phase of the MCU came what some consider to be the worst film of the entire series, in the form of Thor: The Dark World. The Marvel Cinematic Universe has always been a very studio-involved process, with producer Big Kev curating the entire saga rather than taking a more writer and director-led approach. This method may have seen its boons in the likes of the Avengers, not to mention the overall coherency of the universe, but it didn't help the second Thor. The Dark World hit early issues, with director Patty Jenkins, who went on to helm Wonder Woman, leaving the project, and Natalie Portman losing faith in both the film and the studio as a result. This was compounded by Christopher Eccleston's distaste for the way the studio operated, and the mindset of both actors shows in the final product. Nevertheless, the studio marched on with the production and screened the feature to audiences, whose whims they tailored reshoots around. Their main qualm was the death of Loki, and thus his heroic sacrifice was undercut and he was born again. Thus, this sequel was brought to screen complete with its lack of originality and pacing, focusing more on pure fan service than grit or inspired storytelling. The film may have smashed the box office, but it set the course for a series of lackluster films and stopgaps that seemed to exist only to keep the series afloat between the cornerstone features and large-scale universe developments. Number 3. Movie 43. Movie 43, a comedy, I guess you can call it that, anthology film with as many A-listers as you can shake a diamond-encrusted stick at, took $34 million globally against a $6 million budget. But what might sound like a success was actually far from it, and not just for its outstandingly poor domestic performance. The anthology format allowed Peter Farrelly, of Dumb and Dumber fame, who conceived of and partially directed the feature, and the studio to pick and choose which entries to include or drop. As such, following a test screening, the studio opted to cut two of the film's segments, one starring Anton Yelchin as a necrophiliac mortician, and the other starring Julianne Moore and Tony Shalhoub as a couple being interviewed by a detective about the case of their missing daughter. Whether the studio thought these edits would save Movie 43 is anyone's guess, but save it they certainly did not. The film is now widely regarded as one of the worst films ever made, so much so that since its release, suggestions have been abound that Farrelly must have some serious dirt on all of the actors in Movie 43 for them to even consider starring in it. Number 2. Suicide Squad 2016. So when you look at the cast of this film, you've got to ask yourself, how could things go wrong? Well, apparently, everything could go wrong. Suicide Squad will forever be remembered as the middle-of-the-road disappointment of the summer of 2016, rather than the genre-redefining supervillain blockbuster that fans were expecting. This one's fault was the exceptional trailer as much as it was the mixed test screening response. Unable to decide on the tone of the film, which should have been comic violence to rival Deadpool, but was edging closer to a joyless CGI slogfest, Warner Brothers hired the team who cut the well-received trailer to produce a new cut of the film, and produce a new cut they did, something that felt unsurprisingly like a choppy, tonally deaf music video of a film, with every conceivable heavy-duty rock anthem thrown in for good measure. None of this helped, as fans felt that they'd been missold the film on many accounts, not least the trailer and the presence of the Joker. This also upset Jared Leto, who was not aware until the release that his extensive scenes as the Joker had been cut down to a cameo with only around 10 minutes of actual screen time. And number 1, Alien 3. Very early on in auteur-director David Fincher's career, he was brought on board to make the third entry in what was one of the most successful horror franchises to date. Alien 3 should have been a cakewalk, a slam dunk, a back-to-basics xenomorph romp that would have put Fincher immediately in his rightful place next to the first two films' directors, James Cameron and Ridley Scott. But the production was mired in studio interference from the off, beginning with a half-finished script and $7 million spent without a single cell of film being shot. Fincher and Sigourney Weaver made the best of a bad lot, but events came to a head when, following dubious test screening results, the studio, 20th Century Fox, ordered reshoots months after production had concluded and ultimately wrested control away from the director. What resulted was an executive cut film that derailed the focused vision of the franchise. Though a relative commercial success, taking $175 million at the box office against a $60 million budget, it was considered to have underperformed for what it was. As a result of this meddling, Fincher disowned Alien 3 and in recent years has only further solidified this sentiment in interviews. Still, it did set him up for a career of no compromises that has brought some rather exceptional returns. Alien be damned.